Burn in the city and windows are smashed. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris blames the damage on a complete lunatic faction driven by far-right ideology. Far-right, just so we're clear. He would say that, wouldn't he? Irish Justice Minister Helen McEntee looked at the fires and said, "A thuggish and manipulative element must not be allowed to use an appalling tragedy to wreak havoc." A manipulative element wreaking havoc. Oh, the irony. A violent act, an angry reaction, and the only actors authority wants to talk about, to condemn and to initiate action against are those lighting fires. The only possible explanation for such a reaction to the stabbing of children, they must be lunatics of the far right. Already legislation is rushed through the Irish Parliament to enable more state surveillance of the populace, more state control of so-called hate speech. Do you see the playbook yet? How or why could any sentient being miss it? A person would have to wonder if there's just one copy of the playbook, dog-eared after its ceaseless use by London's Metropolitan Police and perhaps reluctantly shared, or whether multiple copies circulate freely with far-right underlined on every page. Children bleed and parents weep. Protesters take to the streets, and politicians and legislators and those they serve, which is not us, patiently reel in the line, knowing the hook is swallowed deep, the barb fixed fast. It's so very hard to resist, after all, the relentless push to hate and to fear. For decades, something deliberately disruptive has been forced on the people of the West. There's no denying it. Mass immigration. People from all over the world have been thrust together virtually overnight and without any sort of foreplay. Before the turn of the century, New Labour were apparently glorying in the thought of rubbing our noses in diversity. It ought never to have happened this way, but it was made to happen this way, and for a reason, by those fear-filled, cowardly authoritarians desperate for the controls they think will save them from the rest of us. What's been done in Europe, done to Europe these years past, has been less advisable than speed dating in the dark with drunk people. And so you get what we've got. Marry in haste, repent at leisure. Not even the most basic due diligence either, so that along with all the decent human beings has come some of all the trouble in the world. And so, by these means, have people been made to hate other people, people they don't know, while all their hate ought properly to be reserved and somehow focused on those they do know, those deserving of being on the receiving end of such destructive emotion. Familiar faces all, cynically stoking the anti-human hatred in pursuit of their master's ends. I have people I love, among them Christians, Jews, Muslims and others besides, or if you prefer, Westerners, Israelis and Arabs. They're my friends. I won't hate on command. Everyone I love hates the hate as well. I won't hate on command, and certainly not on behalf of those who line their pockets and secure their positions by stoking that hatred. And so millions of people have deliberately been made afraid and angry. While all that's going on, a former British Prime Minister, yet another from a grisly cast of characters, each at the head of his own column of countless dead civilians in countless countries, this time the Right Honourable Sir Tony Blair, renews his old calls for the introduction of digital IDs to solve the problems of all that immigration. Tony Blair and his ilk want you frightened and filled with hate. Then you'll beg for the solution they offer, which is slavery for you and freedom for them. Unflushable, apparently, digital IDs and Tony Blair both. Blair has done as much as any of the rest of the club of international ghouls to destabilise the Middle East and to sow the very unrest that sees tides of people rise and walk away from wherever they were born in search of anything else, anywhere else. If your home and everyone else's home for miles around had been bombed flat, what would you do? Where would you go? All over the West, frightened, angry people, overwhelmed by changes to their lives and communities, they feel powerless to influence, are automatically abused by being labelled with names chosen to make them feel isolated, vulnerable, lunatics, far right. All over the world, frightened, angry people are also overwhelmed by fast-moving changes. They feel powerless to influence. One war after another ensures those already on edge stay on edge, while simultaneously being told, ordered, what to think about what they see. Millions of people of every creed and colour marched through cities all over the world demanding a ceasefire in Gaza and were abused in line with the same old playbook. They're labelled as you'd expect, not pro-peace, just anti-this or anti-that. In truth, people of every creed and colour all over the world are only made to feel powerless, denied any sense of their real power by those who work tirelessly to make the mass of the population feel powerless and therefore dependent at all times for their safety and well-being on those above them in the food chain. Out of sight of most, that thin sliver of powerful people displays a level of cynicism that's beyond the comprehension of decent folk. Nothing is off limits to ensure the objectives of those who would do away with nation-states and the freedom of populations, not even children, anyone and everyone's children. Children are exploited like tinder to keep the heat under unrest, to keep as many people as possible distracted by hatred and suspicion of each other, of their neighbours, rather than focusing fury where it belongs, on the ghouls that keep stirring the pot, stoking the fires. And in among it all, what is the word on every authoritarian's lips? Why, democracy, of course. As soon as people, any people, start realising and manifesting their power in any way, those in charge prick up their ears. Democracy in the West is like the toy steering wheel a parent fixes to the dashboard of a car to entertain a toddler, making it think it's steering the car, when of course it isn't. Whenever people find a way to get their feet on the actual pedals, if only momentarily, their hands on the actual wheel, those in power act quickly to correct any possibility of a change of direction. Look at recent moments when the people grabbed the wheel. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, the vote for Brexit here in the UK the same year. In 2019, people gave the Tories an 80-seat majority, the collapse of the Red Wall and all that jazz. But again, it brought only swift retribution, just like the Trump presidency and Brexit brought swift retribution. I've wondered at the coincidence of the pandemic and everything else since 2020, and wondered if it wasn't all the punishment beating meted out to an upstart populace that dared to grab the wheel. Democracy in the West has been made a fraud and a confidence trick, a cut-and-shut used car, a chocolate teapot, an ashtray on a motorbike, snake oil for the gullible. For as long as the present incumbents hold sway, the face men and women of the crime syndicates really running the show, then any notion of democracy, the so-called rule of the people, is what we call in Scotland a busted flush. Too few people are angry with the right people. And by the right people, I mean the wrong uns, that interconnected, interdependent lot that always crops up, spiders on webs. The many of us are goaded and atomised, split by chaos into smaller and smaller, mutually loathing and mutually suspicious factions, while the same few get richer, laughing at us behind our backs on the way to the bank. They have an emergent and growing problem, however, those few. The pesky people are grasping at the wheel again. In the Netherlands, the latest election has given prominence and significance to the PVV, the Party for Freedom, led by Geert Wilders, routinely and loudly dismissed as far-right and extremist. At the other end of the world, in Argentina, the president-elect is Javier Milei, economist and author, and another labelled right-wing and populist. Populists of the people. How dare the people have what they want? Supine journalists obediently squeak the populist word. What they really mean is lumpen scum, casting such politicians and their supporters into Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. Implicit in that deliberate corruption of the meaning of populist, explicit if you're awake, is that we, the people, are the problem. The demos are the problem, which means that for the uniparties, the hybrid Democrat and Republican Party in the US, the hybrid Conservative and Labour Party in the UK, democracy itself, what remains of democracy, is the problem. Trump's a Republican in name only, a loner given independence by his billions. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is another, an outsider with an insider's surname. And yet in the race for the White House, Trump and Kennedy are the front runners, apparently beyond the control of the swamp. Vivek Ramaswamy is apparently outside the tent too, or at least as far as anyone can tell. Even if all of the above are really double agents, the very idea of outsiders is almost spice enough for jaded palates in these decades of bland automatons handed power as if by right in return for allowing themselves to be compromised enough so they'll hold out their hands for whatever they're given by those really in charge. The intention is to drive us off the cliff. With that in mind, does anyone really think they'll let the people into the driving seat? Surely what we face is more censorship, more shutting down, more fracturing of society, more atomisation. When democracy itself is demonstrably the last obstacle in the path of the authoritarians, flimsy, hollowed-out shadow of a thing that it is, what is the future of elections? Even if they happen, courtesy of the uniparty bending the knee to unelected, unaccountable entities like the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, how can the results even matter? Here's the thing, while wars rage and people are made to hate, too many are blind to the real enemy. Joining me tonight is academic and emeritus professor of sociology, Frank Furedi. Frank, What is populism, and how has it become a pejorative?
Well, populism simply means giving voice to the aspiration of the people. And historically, populist and populist movements were able to somehow capture the emotions and the sensibilities that people really care about. And because it's a grassroots movement, and because it very often threatens the powers that be, it has become increasingly seen as a threat. And the moment it's seen as a threat, then basically everything is done to create a playbook whereby the populists, or people who see themselves as populists, are framed in such a way as to demonize and criminalize them. But when you look around, I think the really important thing is that for better or worse, despite all the setbacks that we've suffered, there are groups, political movements all over Europe who are kicking back. I mean, I've been traveling up and down Europe recently, and you go to France, you go to Italy, you go to Holland and Belgium, and there are a minority of people who have formed political parties who are, in a sense, demanding to be heard. And we're living in a very special moment because the mainstream parties understand that they can no longer take for granted that they're running the show. And that's why it's so dangerous at the moment in terms of the future.
Is there anything ideologically in common between those disparate groups across Europe? Or are they all populist in their own contexts for their own reasons?
You raise a very important problem, which is that, well, we have our people who have been moved to react to their circumstance. Basically, people who argue that they want to be part of the conversation. They want to be taken seriously. That's what they're saying. But at the moment, what's really lacking is a political ideology, or at least a sense of a political direction, which could give that positive energy that is there a real direction. So therefore, you have a situation where all over Europe, people are mobilizing, they're organizing. They don't even call themselves populists. They have all kinds of names that they've adopted. But what they have, the one thing that they have in common is solidarity, the aspiration for solidarity, that we really belong to a community. And the other thing that they have in common is that they're demanding to be heard. And that's a very positive development, because you cannot have democracy until people find their voice.
Is there anything unprecedented about what's happening at the moment? And presumably there have always been people who have reflected or given voice to the people. But is there something different happening now?
I think there's one big difference, which is that for the first time since the Second World War, the mainstream political parties, Christian democracy in Italy, social democracy, Labour here, the conservative parties, all these parties have lost their legitimacy. If you look at these parties, they're barely having any serious members or activists anymore. These are zombie parties that are able to perpetuate themselves because of their access to power. And because the legitimacy has been lost by these parties, what you have is a big political vacuum, which creates an opportunity because the political landscape is now far more open than before. And the first important blow against the ruling elites in Europe was the election of Meloni in Italy, because for better or worse, she was labeled as far-right, even fascistic. But yet, when you go to Italy, people love her because she speaks their voice. Since that time, we had a lot of rebellions in Sweden, in France, in Holland. I remember going to Holland very recently and talking to the farmers who've been organizing against the attempt to drive them off the land by various environmental NGOs. And they tell me that, we're in this for the long run. We're not going to give up tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. This is our lives, because if we're driven off the land, it isn't just losing a job, it's losing a way of life. And I think that kind of sentiment is widespread. And I find that extremely inspirational that there are people for the first time doing this. I
was speaking to a friend in the Netherlands, very, very excited and upbeat about what's happened with the PVV, because that's a group and an individual really who was derided and an outlier until very recently. Yeah. And suddenly 1 in 4 Dutch voters have voted for that party and that man.
Well, not just 1 in 4, but usually it's argued that it's the old people that vote for the right or vote for movements like that. If you look at the statistics, the majority of high school students said that they prefer the PVV to any other party. A disproportionate number of young people voted for this. And also, very importantly, Unlike anywhere else, like in England or elsewhere, where there's a big urban and rural divide, in Holland, even people in the big urban areas voted for the PVV because for the first time, they argued they could see that it's necessary. It's an emergency as far as they're concerned, which has been really exacerbated by the war in Israel, because what even a lot of liberal Dutch people are saying, we don't want something that happened to the Israelis to occur in our country.
Got to get to a break.